Hi guys, Mosk here, and here we are continuing with part 2 of champions that I'm concerned to see in the draft, and ranking them in order of least to most concerning. We covered the Mika champions in part 1, so now we're getting into more dangerous territory. I want to preface by saying I actually struggle quite a lot in the ordering of this, as you meet lots of players, all with differing levels of skill. And there are many instances of champions that can seem absolutely egregious when they're played, properly, or at least at the upper end of the skill you face. But you meet so many players who use them that are terrible. So their placement isn't easy and is very much influenced by the last couple or few that you've come across. So I should go without saying that this is just my opinion based on my current experience at the time I made this. Your mileage may differ. I don't really need to say that, right? And ultimately, especially in low elo, where the focus of this tier list and this thought process is coming from, player skill reigns supreme over champion. Like, it does not matter what champion you're playing, so long as if you're playing it well, it's gonna be a threat in low elo. In high elo, champion kits and counter picks and etc. they matter more because the differences in player skill tend to be relatively smaller than they are in low elo, where the differences are vast. Because it's a pool where you've got people who've literally just started the game and people who are doing their 7th iron to diamond climb who've been playing for like a decade, and everything in between. So yeah, pinch the salt, it's just having a bit of fun, let's get into it. Here we go. Okay, this is the tier I've affectionately called Remember the Name. These are champions that make me sit up and pay attention when I see them in the draft because of their high impact, reliably game determining abilities, and or because they seem to attract players with a playstyle that, for better or worse, tends to significantly shape a game. So at the bottom we've got Cho'gath. Cho'gath is not a particularly complex character. He's a big, fat bug thing that has his rupture ability, which is like a ranged area of effect CC knock-up, and his ult that will eat people, executing them below a certain threshold of health and making him steadily bigger over the course of a game. His laning phase is relatively weak and abusable, but he's one of these champions that it doesn't matter how badly he lost lane, if you haven't ended the game by like 30 minutes or so, he's going to be relevant. And in low elo, this is not an uncommon amount of time for a game to drag on for. Essentially, 1 minute he's a scrawny little purple cockroach, and another minute you look around and it's this frickin' behemoth wading down the lane into your entire team, soaking up the everything you can throw at it. It's gonna eat someone, and all the time you're trying to bring it down, all his friends are shooting you or hitting you as well, and it's just If you haven't got someone with Kraken Slayer, Lord Dominix, or otherwise percent health damage, good luck to you. Usually that means you need an ADC who's hit their item spikes and knows how to kite, and I don't need to tell you how much you can rely on that in a low elo. Above Cho'gath we've got my boy Swain, Edgar Allan Lannister himself. So Swain is mostly restricted to the support position because his mobility is so crap that he struggles to survive a solo lane. But other than his old man lack of agility, he's got basically everything else going for him. He's a battle mage that puts out tons of damage. You really should be nearly topping the damage charts in your games. And between his passive that infinitely stacks his health, his ultimate ability, and Zhonya's, he can become very resilient and is basically a walking turret, so long as he can keep up in levels and items. And that's the crux. Swain has to go at least even or win a lane. And the laning phase is where he is weakest. So, early in the game he hasn't stacked his health from getting passive Raven Souls. So he's both immobile and squishy. But he's got decent tools to get through the laning phase, in that he's a pseudo hook champion with his claw on E that passes through minions and can root and displace people, pulling them towards Swain and getting you a passive stack. His W, Eye of Sauron, has a slow effect if it hits, and you can set it up if you land your E first. And often his EWQ combo with Glacial Augment from his runes can be a death sentence if he hits it and gives him good gank setup. So if you're a jungler, please gank for your Swain. He snowballs really, really hard and has the tools to help you pull off the gank successfully. Top tip as well, you can use your W, I think it's actually called Vision of Empire, not only to scout enemy jungle camps and dragons to help your jungler with their jungle tracking, but also to snipe assists in mid lane duels. It's fantastic for getting an extra gold injection, a health stack, and incidentally even helping your mid laner. And you didn't even have to roam, give up lane XP, leave your ADC alone to do it. While I'm talking Swain, I want to just mention a key part of his game plan is the use of his free stopwatch that he gets from the rune. Not only does this save a chunk of gold in the buying of Zhonya's, if you can hold off on using it until you've got your Liandry's Torment, your mythic item, and are like halfway or like most of the way to a Zhonya's, then you're golden. Because this gives you a one-time early use of a stasis ult, which if used to turn a fight towards the end of laning phase can give you a massive boost towards then getting your second item, the Zhonya's, and then once Swain has a mythic and Zhonya's, he's online. When playing against Swain, the earlier you can get him to burn that free stopwatch, the better. And as he's sort of forced to rush his mythic and then Zhonya's, he's a bit weak to magic damage, and he doesn't have long range, so long range magic poke is something of a weakness for him. So yeah, obviously I think Swain is pretty powerful. I flatter myself that I don't often meet Swains who I think are as dangerous on him as me. But if I see him in a lobby, I'm always cautious of the mid to late game monster I know he's got the potential to be. Yeah, a chunky support with CC, enough damage to take on multiple enemies at once, ranged vision. It's just so good in low elo. And I only don't rank him higher because I don't meet that many players that are that good on him. Then we've got Malzahar, solid, straightforward to use mid laner, very repeatable and easy to execute game plan of shove a wave or shove the lane really fast, roam with your ultimate and get a pick. It takes a while to get going, but with his spell shield passive, he's not quite as easy to gank as he seems like he should be. I wouldn't say Malzahar's the best players, but with his R, they just don't need to be. But it's not like Malphites, who I rank much lower down the list, despite having similarly super impactful ultimates, and that Malphites tend to be auto-field players who just do not know what they are doing. Malzahars at least have a basic level of competency. LeBlanc is such a pain in the arse to deal with, especially as I'm a Kindred player. The burst damage combo comes out so quickly and from surprising range. She's so difficult to gank, but sets up ganks really nicely for her jungler. And she's got one of the strongest side lane games of any assassin because of how well she duels and how easy it is for her to escape and lead an entire team on a merry chase on doing laps around the map. She's basically only this far down the list because of how difficult she is to play and the fact that most players you meet in low elo are not up to it and struggle to end the game before the late game 5v5 ARAM team fights where she loses a bit of her effectiveness. Lulu is obviously one of the most annoying supports ever designed. She's a living cock block that actually puts out a surprising amount of damage for an enchanter. It's sort of hard to tell how many Lulus are actually decent players, because how would you really tell? If they've got the basic ability to buff their friends and debuff the enemy when an engage happens, they're doing their job. They're doing Lulu. Like with all champions, you have to judge by the quality of their positioning and movements. And I guess you can tell by how well they pull off enchanter baiting, which is like jail baiting but with worse consequences for the predator. Ultimately, a Lulu is a parasite living in the armpit of their hyper carry, and it's basically a more intelligent, more hand-eye coordinated, evolved form of Yuumi. Garen. Not really much to say here, I guess. He's mechanically possibly the easiest champion to play in the game. But the game is hard, so you Garen mains, don't take that too much to heart. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure there's a fair amount of counterplay to laning against Garen, and as the game drags out, as range champions start to hit their power spikes, he can start to get kited out a bit. But he's basically a big ball of stats that ask the question that if he runs at you and spins at you, can you kill him through his resistances before he executes you? And if he's gotten fed off a poor lane opponent who's trying to play a slightly more complicated champion, whose mistakes haven't been forgiven as generously, then the answer is probably no. And that's really all it boils down to. Garen is incredibly forgiving against newer players, and almost unstoppable if he gets fed early. The saving grace is that they're often newer players themselves, which means they can be prone to horrendous throws where they just run at the enemy base, dive behind 2 towers, fighting 5 people at once, and then eventually go down. Similar to Garen, Mordekaiser is a juggernaut stat ball. He has a couple of skill shots which make him not quite as reliable, but give him more utility. And it's his Death Realm ultimate that really kind of sets him apart as his own kind of unique threat. Because it basically makes it hard for your team to gang up on him and bring him down. And he gets to choose who he wants to 1v1 first. It's particularly annoying around objectives where he can just steal your jungler away so they can't smite the Baron or the Dragon or whatever you're trying to do. So yeah, it's impressive when he's ahead. There are so many players that play Mordekaiser though, you get used to facing him. So I can't put him any higher on the list, and to be honest I think I'm being quite generous with him being up this far. Another beefy beefcake, Kench is a top laner and support who people seem to struggle a lot with. He has quite a strong laning phase it seems in a solo lane, and isn't too bad in support. He's got decent damage and range for a tank, and his resilience in the form of his health shield and what's it called, Abyssal Voyage, his mobility jump thing, makes him relatively forgiving. Kench players in my experience tend to be decent, or at least better than the opponents they get given. And he can influence the enemy team's items that they need to build, like Serpent's Fang or Shadow Flame to deal with his shielding, or Kraken Slayer, that kind of thing to deal with his, or Lord Dominic's to deal with his chunkiness. Singed, everyone's favourite cheesy proxy farmer. More often than not, Singed players are fairly decent due to his sort of like his niche following and unusual playstyle, and so yeah, like he can surprise your top laner and then just be an awful experience to try to gank when he's far ahead. For some reason, I don't know what it is, your team will find it impossible not to chase the enemy Singed. He doesn't really carry a game by himself, but he creates so much chaos that you're usually forced at some point to account for the fact there's a Singed in the game. Bit similar to Singed, we've got Skarner, so one of the least played champions in the game, so much so that I think he's going to get a complete overhaul in the relatively near future. Basically, Skarner's one of these champions that has like the one trick effect, right, where their player is, has more experience playing with Skarner than their opponents have playing against him. He's a chunky, quite fast melee fighter whose ult is basically a death sentence if he hits you with it and drags you into the enemy, into his team. I generally mark top laners down a bit lower than other roles, because they generally have the most delayed impact on the game. So I've got Urgot at the top of the standard bunch. And he's one of these class of fighters that it doesn't matter how badly he loses the lane, he will get to a point where he is a problem. It doesn't matter if he's 0 kills, 5 deaths in lane, if he hits level 9 he's got a Titanic Hydra and a Bramble Vest, he's got a decent shout of 1v1ing anyone else on the map within reason. I've encountered this multiple times, and on top of that, he's got one of the strongest level 1s in the game. There's technically counterplay to him at most stages of the game until he gets like ridiculously super unkillably fed. You can good spacing can help abuse his relatively short range. You can play around his leg cannons, and you can possibly dodge his ult. But this is a champ that even if my top laner is quote unquote winning lane against him, there's always a worry in the back of my mind. So now we leave top lane and head south towards more mid and support territory. And to me, Vel'Koz and Xerath are a bit much of a muchness. They both tend to have like player bases that are sort of equally skilled. You come across players who are good or better than average more frequently than I like, particularly on the enemy team. And they both provide like long-range magical artillery. I put Xerath above Vel'Koz because even though I think Vel'Koz players have a slight edge over Xerath's in terms of player ability, Vel'Koz's skill shots seem overall a little less reliable, and low elo players tend to struggle particularly hard against Xerath, as the range and speed of his skill shots can be surprising, and dodging his ult is something that takes a bit of experience. But yeah, it's really all about the high range, high damage skill shots, because if you can get in close to them, maybe dodge a few of the skill shots on the way, then they don't go down too hard. Beating those two, in my opinion, is Morgana. Similar kit with more straightforward skill shots. The Dark Binding though, being like a billion year stun on the low cooldown long range ability. is obviously a key and game deciding ability. The Black Shield though, it's sort of like the use of that sort of separates Morgana's out a bit, in that is an incredibly powerful thing to be able to put on yourself or your carries in a sticky situation, making them immune to CC and protecting them from a bit of magic damage. Basically making her a hard counter to hook champions, which otherwise are some of the more threatening supports you encounter. So yeah, mage-like damage, one of the best CC abilities in the game, one of the best CC countering abilities in the game, and actually really flexible in that she's actually quite a good jungler. Make this champion pretty dangerous and is basically held back really by her ult, which is a bit difficult to use. It's essentially like Swain ult, but the damage it does is more obvious, and it's also got a stun as well, so people are more inclined to get out of the area. And she doesn't have the forgiving resilience of Swain, because it doesn't heal her at all, so she has to rely on like using her flash to get into position, or flash and Black Shield and then R and then Zhonya's, and the requirement for having Zhonya's sort of locks her build into you've got to go that first or second item, a bit like Swain, which can be a drawback in certain situations. She's a pretty common pick, so there's a broad range of player ability. But every now and then you'll get the good ones that roam around with their jungler and just, get up your arse. Even worse than Morgana's though are Janna's. And you might think, Squishy Enchanter, what does she really do? Witch. She's a witch, I tell you. Janna is a Lulu level cockblock. In order to get to their carries, you've got to wade through a storm of unerringly accurate tornadoes, shields, and then once you think you finally got onto them, she presses her ult and bashes you all away, healing her carry, and then creating all that space that you've got to run through again. She's also really fast, so she plays the enchanter bait game, so well. In that, she'll just dance around in front of you. Ooh, look, I'm Janna, and then you'll be like, well, I'm just gonna go kill that little, scrawny enchantress, and then you just can't quite catch her. And then you're just a bit too far into the enemy jungle and their entire team jumps you. And when other enchanters do it, you occasionally catch them and take them down before you get killed. And it's not worth, but there's that slight satisfaction. With Janna, just no hope, you just don't get her. She's unobtainable, boys. Tristana is a really difficult one for me. I did have her much higher initially, as I personally think she is the best low elo ADC. She is unbelievably safe with her W jumps to kind of get away from any bad positioning. I think it's the W anyway, I could be wrong. Her all-in combo is a bit of a gotcha. It works really well in laning, so she can get up and help support junglers ganking, because ganks aren't always pulled off in the most perfect way. She goes well with lots of different supports. She pushes waves really well, so she can get priority, or she doesn't spend too much time vulnerable and farming. She's got really good scaling because that auto attack range just keeps getting bigger, and range on ADCs is pretty kingly. And on top of all of that, she's got the best of both worlds in terms of front-loaded and back-loaded damage. So, like a marksman, she's got good auto attack damage, good attack speed, so she can up front put out a lot of hurt. But then because of her bomb, you can exit a trade and take more damage than you anticipate, which can lead to extra kills because enemies don't always judge the damage correctly, and even if she dies the bomb still goes off, and you can get a revenge kill that way, which isn't the case for champions like Xayah or Kalista, who have to be alive to actively use their ability to cash in on their damage. Did I mention she also shreds towers like a Ziggs? I don't know why more people don't play her, and maybe there's counterplay that I'm not seeing, or that I don't know about. I don't play ADC. Yeah, honestly, I should have put her higher. I fear her more than Karzix for sure. I think I only dropped her down this low because it seems to me like the strength of the character compensates for the player, and the players I tend to find aren't that great. Haven't seen many Graves recently. He's not the powerhouse I think he was in season 11, where he was just absolutely dominating. But I think he's still really strong. He's got a decent first clear. I know it's not the fastest, but he, is freaking healthy, and his map mobility with his dash for over walls like Kindred is really good. That always makes it flexible. He scales like a monster. He's really tough for a marksman. He can flex into top lane. Yeah, he's just all around a solid champion. As I haven't faced many recently, I've sort of lost a sense of the skill of the players, but I do know that Smurfs tend to favour him. Another classic Smurf jungler is Karzix, perennially near the top of many jungle tier lists that you see here, there and everywhere, because of how well this champion thrives on the chaos of solo queue. He has eye-watering one-shot potential, similar to Rengar with his isolated damage, on top of having a huge leap on a relatively short cooldown it seems, and of course his R allowing him to go invisible multiple times in the same fight. Oh, and a scatter shot ranged ability that does decent damage and a significant slow. Kha'zix seems to be like an AD version of Evelynn, and should actually be scarier as he's stronger earlier. He's not as easy to early invade as an Evelynn. His leap gives him a more versatile engage, and the other ways play similar by invisibly coming up behind you and taking out the squishies of your team. But I don't know. And Kha'zix is supposed to be a hard counter to Kindred as well. I guess I just don't find the players are particularly bright. I mean, I've certainly been smashed by them, but they seem to be more prone to uncoordinated engages or getting picked off in being in the wrong place. Shaco is a real dichotomy, right? He can be really bad or unbeatably good. He can play both jungle and support, although I haven't seen him played in support very frequently recently. Please, for the love of God, dodge the game where your top laner decides to go Shaco top. He probably thinks he's smurfing, and the game probably thinks that he's the highest rated player on your team, and has balanced things with the expectation that he'll carry. He won't. This has happened to me too many times. Save yourself the misery. But yeah, bad Shaco jungle won't gank as much or be as successful as much as he should be, and basically end up as an annoying cannon minion. Good Shaco jungle is the world's most lethal cockroach. He's literally everywhere, ganking any laner that dares to step up towards the middle of their lane, constantly harassing you if you even try to step into the river. And you can never kill the fucker because he just goes invisible and blinks away if he feels that the fight doesn't favour him. And when he's fed, he will just one-shot your squishies. I've even seen them just jump into the middle of 3 or 4 of my teammates, take someone out and just fuck off before they even had a clue what was happening. He seems to be quite a popular pick against my champions, at least I face him fairly regularly. Back when I was climbing through bronze, they weren't really an issue. But the recent ones as I've been moving through silver have just been such negative play experiences. My understanding is that if you late invade him on his raptors where he usually starts, you can really gimp his game. Because he'll only have his Jack-in-the-Box ability and is normally alone because he likes to start leashless. But there's no way your laners will follow that, and it's pretty a ballsy move to do that alone. So yeah, good Shaco is way higher on the list than this placement, but bad Shaco is way lower, so it sort of ends up around here. Fagar is a hyperscaling burst mage. He's got a simple kit which makes him popular in low elo. His main abilities are his Event Horizon Cage, which takes up a massive amount of space, his great self-appeal, great zoning, great in team fights, and his R, which is basically an unmissable death ray that will likely execute you if you're anywhere below half health, depending on how many stacks he's managed to get. So yeah, he's a popular champ, you can counter him a lot. He's been particularly strong in mid and support this season, but is basically always around no matter what the meta is. As he's popular, the range of player skill is really wide, erring on, slightly below average. But his kit is so good in low elo that you're forced to give him a bit of respect, no matter how undeserving, so I couldn't put him any lower on the list really. Heimerdinger is an area control mage that people tend to struggle against in lane. And he's not that common, so maybe people don't know how to handle him very well. Well, his game plan is fairly straightforward. He just sets up turrets in the middle of the lane, and endlessly pressures his opponent off CS, because it's really difficult to short trade with him, and even worse if you try to go in for a long trade after he's got his setup. After he's level 6 and has got a stasis item, he can legitimately 1v2, so early ganks are probably needed to deal with him, but even then, most laners seem to struggle. After laning phase, it sort of depends, right? So he's really good at area control, good in death balls. If he gets his setup around objective, it's really hard to push the enemy team off them. But at the same time, he's got to commit to an area to set his little turrets up in, so if the fighting is too dynamic, he can get left behind. Heimerdinger is really versatile in that he can play mid, top or bot, and usually the players seem to have an average to above average level of experience. Basically, his playstyle significantly shapes the game in a particular way, and one that it's more often than not the enemy team isn't as prepared to deal with. Syndra, don't see much of Syndra nowadays. She used to be a power pick, I think, when I very first started playing, but yeah, in the time since, not really seen a lot of her. When I do see her, she tends to be a handful for her opponent in lane phase, at least when she's on the enemy team. And going within a half a screen of her when she's got her ult is basically a death sentence for anything short of a tank. Her impact seems to lessen as the game goes on, into the late stages, although by that point she's probably wrecked mid and potentially bot lane. And more often than not, the players seem to have some experience. Next we have the infamous Kassadin, one of the best late game champions in the game. Supposed to be a little bitch in laning phase, but you know what? They never are. A game with Kassadin is such a coin flip because, regardless of how good they are, almost regardless of the game state, they'll basically play like they think they're Fizz. They'll rotate to every fight in a river. They'll constantly be moving down to bot lane. Presumably it's hard to lane safely in CS with this champ, so what they do instead is just sack it off completely and look for picks and roams for an accelerated gold injection. And it'll either work and their team has a hyper accelerated Kassadin that's just going to wreck face, or you've got a super toxic caster minion spamming the surrender vote. Because oh my lord, can these guys be toxic? You don't even think about touching their wave. So really these mid lane mages, and I guess Kassadin's more of an assassin than a mage, but yeah, they're all sort of much of a muchness. I've ended up putting Lysandra and Anivia slightly higher. Not really because they have more game impact than the others, but just I think that they tend to be decent players and they tend to be more consistent. Lysandra's in particular seem to be quite clever players. They put in a lot of hard work. They generally have decent map awareness and respond to river fights. They counter assassins quite well and so generally make quite reliable, solid laners. I've never been sorry to have Lysandra on my team. But for whatever reason, they seem to lack a bit of oomph needed to, take the game over the line, which would otherwise make me more concerned to see them on the enemy team. Anivias are a bit more hit and miss. Sometimes you get a great one. Sometimes they're a bit less good. They have great zoning potential. The wall in particular can be fantastic, although it is a bit of a double-edged sword. But just in general, they pack a wallop when they hit with that freaking ice ball, whatever it is. Aurelia just squeezes ahead of the mages because when she's in the game, it's just always something that you have to be concerned about. She can straight up dumpster laners that aren't prepared for her. She's flexible and she can go top and mid, so she can do that in either of those lanes. She's a very hard character to play well. I certainly can't play her. That Q and its targeting just mess me up. So I give a bit of grudging respect to these players because generally they're good enough to utilise her to to at least output some power. Although I did 1v1 once with Rakan. But yeah, mostly she's a dicey target to gank, and I've seen them shred team fights often enough that I'm not thrilled to see her against me in the lobby. Pantheon and Galio both have a similar sort of play style. They're looking to bully lane, shove waves, and roam to side lane fights or to river skirmishes, where they provide lockdown and good damage, which makes them pretty scary. Pantheon provides more damage, like more burst and pick potential than Galio, but Galio shoves waves faster and, seem to be more grounded players. I'm probably biased because my friend is a Pantheon main and I don't quite understand some of his decisions sometimes. But yeah, these guys are generally a menace to any jungler or side laner trying to happily go about their business. It may be a bit surprising to find these next few up this high, but I've got my reasons. For Vi, there's a decent argument I can see for putting her a bit lower. She's a very good champion for learning to jungle with, and so attracts kind of newer junglers, which brings the threat down considerably. But her kit is really simple, and if you can hit her Qs, extremely effective for shutting down a particular player. She's got good damage, she's fairly resilient with her shields, she can put a dent in pretty much anything she comes across. Struggles a bit with hyper-mobile champions that can run circles around her, and is prone to ambitious engages that her team struggle to follow up on. But as a Kindred player, I hate seeing Vi against me. As she's strong early, scales surprisingly well, and yeah, you just can't get away from her. My one and only pentakill I've achieved was on Vi, where I chased the entire enemy team from our tier 1 turret all the way to their fountain. Poppy and Ivan are both quite different champions, but I've got them here for the same reason. They are almost always excellent players, or at least so much better than me and my team that it's pretty much the same thing. Poppy is a tank that's basically got as much damage as any fighter, good shields, an ability that hard counters dashing around her, a stun, and supreme disengage or peel with her ultimate hammer. I can't remember a game I've had with her in it that she wasn't a problem in some form or other. Ivan players are a rare breed, always highly confident but less volatile than Poppy's. And yeah, I think they rely a lot on low elo junglers just not having a clue about how their clear works. And they relentlessly gank the shit out of every lane. If you ever try to invade them or harass them in the river, the rest of their team is there, looking out for good old Ivan, who's looking out for them. With his shielding, he's unbelievably difficult to kill. Like he can do the enchanter bait, basically, where you think, he's not going to be that difficult to kill. I could probably take him out before the rest of the guys get there, and you just can't. You just can never quite get the fucker. He's got a ranged root, a bit like Morgana, and it actually turns, gives his team extra engage potential, although I rarely see that being used well. Vision control with his bushes, obviously the obnoxious shielding that I mentioned, and his ultimate is calling in the pet Daisy, which is basically a stand-in frontline for low elo teams that generally are all packed to the gills with assassins and high damage, fairly squishy champions. On top of Ivan himself bringing much needed utility. So really I would have these guys much further up in terms of my worry when I see them in the draft, if it weren't for the fact that they just can't carry the game by themselves. They do need their team there to help take them over the line. But they know their job and they do it well. Zoe is an incredibly dangerous champion to her team and the enemy. Probably no player in the game I've ever played has been good enough to pilot her properly. But it doesn't matter, because burst damage and hard CC on epically long ranged abilities smoke low elo fools. Throw all her other abilities out the window if she sleeps you with a trouble bubble and then nails you with that whatever that slingshot's called. You are going to fountain. I'm convinced decent Zoe players aren't found south of Platinum, so the ones in my games are struggling enough with geometry to be killable. Yeah, I see Zoe and I worry because I know I'm going to experience some miserable deaths. Vlad. Anyone playing Vlad in Ranked has probably and hopefully put in significant practice. In my mind, this is a limp noodle of a champion, which basically gives me a free mid laner to help roam around and dominate the map. And then we can check in about 35 minutes in and see if he's relevant yet. You know who's going to be wrecking bot lane with a tower dive at 12 minutes? Yeah, it's Vlad. You know how I really want to gank? Set behind, stop his scaling, free up my mid laner from whatever they're doing in lane, but can't because he's always got his freaking blood pool up. Vlad. So yeah, Tryndamere is generally a problem because he scales into an unkillable monster and is always better than your mid laner. But he's just pipped by the next two AP assassins who come online a bit earlier, to 1 or 2 items, and are just as unfreaking unkillable. Fizz is only played by awful human beings who are spawned from the toxic sludge that they type. They'll perm a heavy trade from the word go, and then if they lose they'll sit around crying under their tower saying no ganks, and if they win then you've got a little frickin' devilfish migrating between mid and bot lane, leaving a trail of one-shotted bodies in their vicious little wake. Thankfully, they're seldom that good at throwing their R and actually, hitting with it. But unfortunately, that doesn't stop your team from then walking back into the danger zone, or if they do get hit by it, walking over to you to share the love. Needless to say, the untargetable Playful Trickster ability is one of the most annoying abilities in the game. It makes you waste so many skill shots or abilities. And the only consolation is that it makes them so overconfident and aggressive that they'll generally give you plenty of opportunities to try to shut them down, and it's kind of the game sort of depends on whether or not you can do that. Echo is basically a similar thing. There are more bad Echo players than Fizz players, but the good ones are just as oppressive and frustrating as the Fizzes. Malzahar has got a good range for what it is, but Echo can poke more easily with his E. Echo's engage is even longer than Fizz's. If he's on the same screen as you, chances are he can probably get to you. His W's a conditional area of effect stun. It's difficult to land, but it's got a scary stun time, and that threat makes it a great zoning tool. And his R obviously lets him dive towers like they're not there, which is really good because tower dives are the most effective ganks. The victims lose the most from them in terms of golden experience from minions, and also in terms of people being able to then hit their tower quite often. And on top of that, his ult is just a get out of jail free card. If he missteps, he's allowed to be forgiven for mistakes in a way that few other champions are. I'm certainly not saying he's easy to play. He's pretty complicated. There's a lot of moving parts going on there. But if you can get through his weak early levels, get that proto belt in good time, he's got a lot of snowball potential, fantastic wave clear, and one of the best scalings of any assassin. Echo is also more flexible in terms of role than Fizz in that he can mid or jungle equally well. If I was to pick a champion to one trick to help you climb as far as you could and keep you interested along the way, I would be looking quite strongly at Echo. But above Echo, I have to put Vex. Vexes always seem to be solid players in that they're always better than their lane opponent. They're not that difficult to gank, but there is an element of risk because, like Poppy, she's a bit of a counter dash champion. And if you're not careful, she'll get away and put a massive chunk of damage on you in return. It usually doesn't matter even if I do manage to kill her a couple of times, because by mid-game, she's slinging around that ult and going in on what, I would think quite aggressive engages for, otherwise squishy and not very mobile mage. But most of the time, she makes at least one person explode and gets away with it. Twitch is a notorious hyper carry and cheeser, and the cheeses either work relentlessly or backfire spectacularly. Odds are probably in their favour most of the time, as Twitch is an acquired taste, so most pilots I imagine have put a fair amount of time into him. Their skill is usually much higher than the average ADC, but due to his comparatively weak laning, he tends to lean quite heavily on his support, preferably a Lulu or like jungle, to help him get over that first initial hump. Or else it's time for risky plays in terms of trying to get picks, cheesy picks like in mid lane, and just hope that works out and compensates for the golden experience he's missing in lane. He can be played jungle as well as ADC, but you don't see it very often anymore, as I think it relies really heavily on him getting a kill from a gank at level 2, because otherwise he struggles a bit to clear his camps. So yeah, see Twitch in the lobby and you know the game is not going to be peaceful. So now we're getting into the champions that you groan to see in the draft. And who better to represent this section than the Wind Brothers? Like Kassadin, Yasuo's and Yone's are complete coin flips. They will, without exception, gun hard to a trollish degree from the word go. Given the technicality of their playstyle, Yasuo more than Yone. I think Yone is a bit easier, based only on the fact that controlling his dashes is a bit more straightforward. They have a consummate reputation for being the most egregious feeders on the Rift. Intentional or not, it's hard to tell, as the meme about the 11 death power spike is so well worn, there might actually be something to it. But yeah, so more than any other champions, these two attract greasy anime protagonist wannabes, the vast majority of whom are clearly barely in control of their abilities. And the kicker is, it doesn't matter how many times they've died, if they get to, I don't know what it is, like level 11 and two items, they're suddenly a threat no one can afford to ignore, because there's always a chance their face will mash enough buttons to kill half your team. The great majority of the time, I'm convinced most people ban them to stop them from actually being on their team. But as I say, you can never quite count them out, and woe betide you actually get a good one against you. Fiddlesticks. Fiddlesticks is an odd one. I've never really been that bothered by Fiddlesticks. Like Karzix, he's a notoriously consistent solo queue jungler, never really falls out of meta. And I'm rarely wowed by Fiddlesticks players' skill, compared to like Ivan players, for example. I get that his first clear is important and takes a bit of dedicated practice to get going, so give the players who can do it credit there. Yeah, just generally not impressed by their quality. However, when I look back over like my win rates against Fiddlesticks, it's not good. He takes a decent number of games off me. And I think this is due to the fact that, so he's not a particularly strong dueling champion early. So when I run into him and invades and counter ganks, I feel like I get the better of him and I'm not too pressured. But then we start to get to mid and late game and my team will just not respect the fog of war behind walls. I swear he's not that uncommon, but for whatever reason, for most of my teams, it seems like they've never played against him before. I can only ward so much and ping the suspiciously dark areas, so much. So yeah, Fiddlesticks. Simple, effective and reliable game plan that demands you respect it or else. Evelyn and Nocturne are similar to Fiddlesticks and they both present problems that low elo teams struggle to deal with. They both exploit the vision game, and are extremely adept at picking off players who are out of position and split off from the main group. Nocturne is a much more simple champion than Evelyn, and I grudgingly give Evelyn's the nod as being better players, but it sort of works out roughly the same in the end. Going into a game with these two, you know you're in for an uphill battle. Your team is going to die to them relentlessly, and you've just got to hope against hope they've got the good sense to stay together more often than not, and that the demonic assassins mess up their picks enough times that you can clinch the game. And in theory, playing against Evelyn should not be that difficult. Like, she's got a pretty weak first few levels. She might try to ambush you at Scuttle Crab, but other than that, she really wants to just kind of be left alone and do her clearing, so she can get a nice quick level 6. So as a jungler, you really need to make sure you invade her deep and pressure her hard. But they know this too, and so often they're quite cautious, and for whatever reason, I don't often find I'm effective at doing this. Once they've got their perma invisibility, then the hunter becomes the hunted, and it's time for them to start going at you. But there's relatively straightforward counterplay that becomes easier to achieve the later the game goes on, and that's to stay grouped as much as possible, and whenever you're about to fight, drop a pink ward behind your backline. Evelyn's almost always approach from a rear flank. And knowing that's maybe a bit scary, but think about what it's doing to the enemy team. So basically, whenever you've got an Evelyn on your team, you are never grouped as 5 people. You're grouped as at best 4 people, with Evelyn kind of running around in the jungle going, ha ha ha, I'm invisible, no one can see me. And it becomes a bit of a coordination issue, because if she goes in too early, she'll get lit up, and then her team's a player down. But on the flip side, her team has got to trust that if they engage in this potential 4v5, that she's going to come in at the right time to help them swing it. But the chances is that your low elo solo queue team are going to keep good formation, ward appropriately, not stand in the middle of a lane or in an obvious bush on low health trying to back. Or that your ADC isn't going to decide that they need to go for a piss alone in the woods, pretty low. So unfortunately, Evelyn is a bit of a problem. Nocturne does a very similar thing in that he's often lurking off somewhere, split off from his team, looking for a straggler pick or looking for a good engage angle. But the range of his ult makes his engage much more flexible and forgiving. The difference is that unlike Evelyn's ult, which he can use to escape or kill people and escape at the same time, Nocturne doesn't really have the same sort of escape. And once he's in, he's usually not coming out. The only other thing to say is that on top of being mechanically easier to play than Evelyn, he's also stronger at early levels, and it's pretty good level 3 dueling capacity. Rammus is a face I hate to see on the enemy team. For one thing, I play Kindred, and he normally doesn't make that a fun time. But just like people cannot resist chasing the Singed, your team will not be able to resist hitting the Rammus. There could be an essentially naked nubile ADC just right there in front of them, but they'll see that low health bar on the Rammus and they'll go all in on it. I know he's got a taunt, but that's not what I'm talking about, and you know it. So yeah, a Rammus that knows what he's doing, and more often than not they do, can be a major problem because they'll move around the map at 1 billion miles an hour, run into your team, cause mayhem and havoc, and then all tire themselves out trying to kill him whilst the rest of his team just shoots him to shreds. It's not a fun time against a good Rammus that gets ahead. So now we come to Viego, a very, very popular jungler at the moment. And it's easy to see why, because the guy snowballs really, really well. and excels in messy skirmishes where he can get resets on his ult and basically roll a good portion of your team in fights that should otherwise be much closer. His invisibility and speed up in his mist and his little like lunging stun aren't really that much of a problem. It's basically all on his really high raw damage and bullshit ability resets he gets just from using his ult and from the bodies he possesses, for want of a better word. And especially the fact he becomes untargetable whilst he's engaged in said possession. I found that he's quite vulnerable to be invaded on his first clear, and there is night and day between a behind and a fed Viego. And I face him a lot, so I'm already fairly used to him. But every game it's always the big question, is he going to get that skirmish that he just hard wins and starts building an unstoppable lead? At about the same level of threat as Viego, I've got Lee Sin, the people's jungler, the face of the role. A good Lee Sin is a sight to behold, and for Kindred even scarier than Karzix because no one likes being kicked out of their respite. And he just sticks to you like autoclave tape. So yeah, an aggressive early game jungler, he's going to be ganking, he's going to be putting a ton of pressure on the map, duels and skirmishes exceptionally well, he's great at dives, and always seems to have responsive laners. And if he gets a significant lead, his sustain, mobility and damage just make him a monster. He might not scale as well as something like Viego, but you know, he lasts a pretty long time and has colossal impact in the early parts of the game. The only thing stopping him from being placed higher is the fact that he's very complex and challenging to play, and most people in low elo aren't up to it. And now we're getting to the stretch of traditional low elo stompers, who nevertheless aren't quite disgusting enough to make it into my top 10. Jax is an infamous late game super carry, although I'm going to be honest, of recent he's steadily been falling from my worry list. He used to be right up there at the top, among the champions I consider the scariest on the Rift, but it's now been a long time since I've encountered a good one. And I've played with a few recently, and they've all been on my team, and they have all been consummate dog shit. But out of respect for what I know he can do, I still keep him highly rated. And the sight of him in queue puts me on edge. Why is that? Well, Jax has a very strong level 1 in lane. He also can flex into the jungle. And there he's not too much of a threat, and, at least in the early levels, but he's not a pushover either if you encounter him during an invade. Which you should, because you need to put him behind. And his ganks are decent with a leap and a stun. But it's when he gets a couple of items under his belt that he just, oh my goodness, he becomes so strong so quickly. And he only keeps getting stronger. By late game, he's a good call for the best duelist in the game. He's a split pushing demon and will absolutely demolish a side lane of its towers. And whilst it's not his forte, he's not really a slouch in a team fight either. But that is another drawback of Jungle Jax, in that if his top laner wants to split push, he also wants to split push, and so it forces a less ideal position for one of them, or forces a 1-3-1 formation, which isn't always appropriate. But yeah, Jax, if he can make it through his early game without feeding his ass off, and that is a big if of recent, there are few champions that are scarier to face. One of those champions could arguably be Nasus. Very passive laning phase, the players have got to have a lot of patience, I give them that. But if he can keep control of his wave and CS appropriately, he will inevitably become a 1v5 death god. And that's not something low elo players can consistently manage to do. But if they can, he's not the easiest thing in the world to punish, as tower diving a Nasus is a pretty risky endeavour, and past a certain point, even 2v1ing him becomes a bit problematic, especially if he's managed to somehow overcome the obstacles and get ahead in his lane. And you get to see it time and time again. Nasus gets big stacks, and Nasus just runs over the game. It's not uncommon to find late game Nasus happily 1v5ing for a good minute, and not necessarily losing. The one saving grace is, as there are a lot of Nasus players, not all of them are that good, and they tend to get overconfident, bite off more than they can chew, and start throwing a bit. Essentially, someone picks Nasus and the game is on a time limit. And he's much worse than Kayle, because it seems like he's more forgiving at all stages of the game. Tryndamere is a renowned negative play experience that very few people seem to enjoy the prospect of facing. The champion's identity is a high-tempo, high-pressure split pusher. He has crit naturally built into his kit with his rage bar, and so can do an unholy amount of damage very, very quickly to champions and towers and minions alike. Coupled with that, he is extremely mobile, with a low cooldown terrain scaling dash, which is also an attack on his E, which allows him to engage and escape fights essentially at will. Once he's on top of you, he's extremely sticky because he just presses his W and slows you when you try to move away from him. He tends to build a lot of attack speed and regen, which on top of his mobility makes him pretty hard to kill by itself. But then he's got his ult, which, as everyone in the world except for the players that are on your team know, makes him invincible for several seconds. And later on in the game is something like a 20-second cooldown or something ridiculous. The trick, like when dealing with Alawi, is to bait him into using it, space him out until it's over, and then kill him. Unlike Alawi though, he'll typically wait until later on in the fight when both of you have committed resources to getting yourselves low before using it. And his mobility makes it much harder to space him if he wants to keep attacking you, or he could just decide just to leave. Tryndamere basically forces your team to prepare, save, and commit their hard CC resources to him. So yeah, the counter to Tryndamere is CC, but guess what?
CC is the counter to everybody!
It's a resource that Tryndamere demands from you that you're then not using on something else, like say Master Yi. Tryndamere's forte is being in a side lane or kind of otherwise somewhat isolated from the rest of the map, where he can basically fight less people at once and restrict his enemy's ability to gang up on him, whilst at the same time pushing waves extremely fast, pushing towers extremely fast, moving around the jungle and taking camps really fast. You know, it all just flows together. Playing team fights is less ideal for him because of the chance of being ganged up on, but he can cause an unholy amount of chaos in such a situation. He takes up a lot of space because he can engage really quickly and he can shred a back line if he gets to them, so he demands a heavy focus, which is then not being distributed to the rest of his team. My pet top laner, one of his mains is Tryndamere, and he loves team fighting. It's a bit of a personal preference, but he shows that the champion can do it. Like, he's often over level because he's a solo laner, and very often he will just dive in 1v5, smack him a bit, press his R to absorb burn their abilities. He might not even kill someone, he may even kill someone, and then fuck off back out. I'm not saying it's a good way to play. It shouldn't work, but low elo teams tend to be so poorly coordinated that it does. That he burns their resources, and that gives us an advantage later on. So on top of this powerful, versatile and forgiving kit, which is incidentally one of the easiest in the game to play, it's one of the least technically demanding, which is not to say completely brain dead. I think in order to play Tryndamere well, you need to have good map awareness and a sense of strategic and positional flow around the map. But yeah, on top of this, he's not weak at any stage of the game. He's weakest in the early game, pre-6, when he doesn't have his ult, but he's still, fairly, at least average. In lane he has incredible sustain because he doesn't use mana, and he naturally builds a resource, Rage, by hitting things, which he wants to do, and then can consume that to recover his health. So the fact he can heal up after trading by consuming this resource, and the fact that the Rage itself gives him like a crit % chance, makes it quite difficult for, I guess, both players to gauge how a trade is going to go. So I guess kind of in earlier levels, Tryndamere is a bit RNG, although the Tryndamere players should presumably be more used to that than their enemy. In early levels, I think his wave clear isn't the best until he gets Tiamat or Iron Spike Whip or some other item to help him. But it's not terrible because his spin can just damage the whole wave. His ult and mobility make him pretty tricky to tower dive and allow him to escape ganks relatively well. So he's not particularly an appealing gank target, and on top of the fact that, you know, it doesn't really matter if he's behind because he's always got that split push strategy to fall back on. So really the weakness with Tryndamere is that it's less about him specifically and more about what he does to his team. If he doesn't split push effectively, and if they don't play appropriately around it, then the enemy usually have advantage to leverage weight of numbers where they want to. So yeah, I see Tryndamere as an incredibly safe, easy to play, powerful pick that is really only held back and really only in this tier rather than being up at the top for the fact that his power is such a crutch that low elo players don't tend to develop very much at the game. So whilst even a truly shit player can still pose a problem on Tryndamere, the mental handicap you acquire through playing him usually gives the enemy team enough windows to have at least the opportunity to win. Amumu, a little turd wrapped in toilet paper that just won't flush. Usually seen as a jungler but sometimes as a support, has a relatively weak early game but scales into a team fighting monster. And he basically excels in situations where he's allowed to scale, doesn't get pressured early, the game goes on late, and tends to gravitate towards big 5v5 punch-ups. So basically almost every low elo game ever played. And there's really not much more to say. It's like he's got decent ganks because he's got a gap close and lockdown CC. The bandage toss is a skill shot, but it has good range and seems like it's got a forgiving hitbox, and since his rework he can now do it twice. His little piss puddle augments magic damage, which includes his own. And he builds tanks so he ends up getting really chunky. Yeah, so like just basically he's got a one-track mind in that he's going to try to scale up, throw in a few ganks to help get some of his lanes ahead with his CC, and then just every fight, he's going to be looking to try to frontline, dive in, pick someone with his little bandage toss, dive into the middle of as many people as possible, hit them with his little magic vulnerability puddle, and press his ult, which then just stuns everybody in a massive radius for a good few seconds, and then the rest of his team just light up the people caught. And in low elo, since people are out of position and surprised all the time, it's gonna get somebody, and the area is massive, so it's gonna catch the people around them that thought they were safe. It's just such an extremely reliable, game-changing combo. And honestly, I cannot tell how good Amumu players generally are. They all just seem to waddle around, not doing anything fancy until they eventually win. Just beating Amumu to the top spot of this group is Hecarim. And this is probably quite biased by the old Hecarim meta, where they could just farm and gank faster than anyone, get really chunky but also output tons of damage. But I honestly haven't seen many Hecarims this season, so I've probably got a hangover from that, from the previous season where they were super strong, and then I haven't really had many games to dissuade me of that. But I haven't seen them as much, so the power level has probably dropped a little bit. Nevertheless, Hecarim's kit is just generally solid for a jungler. It revolves around speed, and speed is one of the key attributes for a good jungler. He can get around the map to places he needs to be quickly. He's got AoE damage abilities which allows him to clear his camps quickly. So he can fit well into a farming meta, but if it's not a farming meta, if ganking is, the thing du jour, then he's got good ganks because of his speed. He can come in from river, or even from the lane, not even needing the bushes. He can even lane gank just from his speed. It's not ideal, he'd prefer to come in from a different angle, but he can still do it. And once he's there, he's got displacement abilities to prevent enemies escaping so easily. He's got really decent burstish damage, but also sustained fighting. And he's robust. He's chunky. Even if things go wrong, he can take the punishment and and has the tools to escape. When he's got a lead, it just feels oppressive. It's a bit like Kayn in that so he's keeping up in levels with his farm because he farms very fast, but it seems like he's relentlessly ganking lanes all the time, and your team just can't deal with it. And when he's snowballed, he's just an unkillable juggernaut. And usually with juggernauts, the counterplay is to kite them out but you can't do with that with Hecarim because he's got such good gap close. So really the only way to deal with him is to hope that someone can lock him down with CC and then bring all guns to bear and hope you've got enough damage to take him down. That and relentlessly invade him early so that you delay him long enough that he can't get his stride going, because I guess playing Hecarim from behind is probably not the best experience. So yeah, both Hecarim and Amumu start to draw a bit of a groan from me. I guess what separates them is that as a Kindred player I find Hecarim harder to kite, but also Hecarims tend to seem like they know what they're doing, more often than not. The champion has some good potential power, and they seem to be experienced and intelligent enough to apply it. So as I've managed to somehow hit an hour doing this, I'm going to call it here for this video, and leave you in suspense as to what could possibly be in the top echelon of the champions that in low elo I dread to face. There was a bit of a gap between me uploading part 1 of this series and this part 2 video. Hopefully I'll be able to get part 3 out fairly quickly. But it's interesting to see that over the course of season 12 I still stand by pretty much all of these. The only thing I would probably change is moving Shyvana up into this level and pretty high on this level. Maybe just behind Amumu even, or around Amumu Hecarim level. And in case you're wondering, that's because of her oppressive tank build, the very recent changes to the dragons, making them more important objectives. And yeah, I've just faced several Shyvanas over the course of the season, and all of them have been just a pain to deal with. So yeah, hope you found that fun. Until the next one, take care.